New Vegas has a lot of mods. Like, too many mods. Too many. One of the most famous series of mods is the Someguy series, which people told me was great. And they were wrong. They're not great. Why aren't they great, though? You say, waiting for a wave of understanding to wash over you before the tides of oblivion carry you away. Well, you're in luck, because I made a video about this. Let's go! New Vegas Bounties I is, objectively, the worst mod in the series, which is fine, since this is the first mod in the series. Some jankiness is to be expected, and that's okay. However, as the series goes on, it's only the jank that disappears. The major issues that strike at the very core of the first Bounties are issues that end up shadowing the entire Someguy series. Even the better mods in the series suffer from being in the shadow of this mod. But for now, there's just the one mod, and the problems that keep it from being as good as it could have been. The premise of Bounties is dead simple. Get it? They're bad guys in the wasteland, and you have to kill them. In time, the series will have a somewhat sprawling narrative filled with various characters of questionable writing quality. But for now, what story there is to be found is just the story of you killing some bad dudes. This mod is born out of a desire to add more things to kill in New Vegas. New Vegas certainly isn't lacking in things big and small to kill, but a lot of those kills carry narrative weight to them. It's never as simple as just getting a job and killing someone. Even the vanilla game's bounty hunter quest, 3-card bounty, focused rather heavily on the narratives of the targets and those around them, rather than the actual act of hunting the target. Someguy makes a deliberate choice to simplify the experience by cutting out the narrative almost entirely. The story is not the focus of Bounties I. There's only one real character, Randall, and even then, he's less of a character and more just the guy who gives you more contracts. The focus is entirely on the hunt, and only the hunt. Bounties is dedicated to making that hunt as fun as it can be. That's an admirable goal. After all, having more simplistic quests to play through is a nice change of pace. The problem is that Bounties, all 3 installments, are built on the erroneous idea that New Vegas' combat is inherently enjoyable. The Gamebryo engine doesn't do melee combat well, and it does ranged combat even worse. Combat in New Vegas is slow, awkward, and lacks any sort of impact. It's either over in a flash or devolves into a war of attrition between you and an overleveled monster. There's a reason most people use VATs. It's not just because it looks cool. It's because it's far more effective and far more enjoyable to use that over free aiming. And even then, pointing and clicking isn't all that exciting. Bad combat is not exclusive to New Vegas. It's a problem the series as a whole suffers from, and not something Someguy can really control. The weak combat in these games is excused at least somewhat because it's not the point of a Fallout game. Even the combat-heavy Fallout 4 put most of its effort into its main story and settlement building. People play Fallout to explore a post-apocalyptic world, to make choices and interact with well-written characters. The stronger aspects of New Vegas, the writing, the choices, the character building, are all there to help make up for the deficit of the combat. If you take that all away for the sake of a pure combat experience, all you do is push the combat's flaws front and center, which creates an experience as rough and as awkward as the combat itself. This could have been allayed somewhat if the people you killed were interesting to fight, or at least interesting people. This is never the case. Randall is the only character in New Vegas Bounties because your targets are not characters. They exist solely to get killed by you. They're 2-dimensional cartoon villains. Worse, many of these characters are references. References aren't bad on their own, but in the case of the mod, the reference is the character. There's nothing else to them other than the reference. If you don't know the reference, you'll probably be confused because you lack context. If you do know the reference, then you'll be well aware about how uncreative these characters are. Some references are subtle, like the Hannibal Lecter serial killer and the Clockwork Orange target. Most, however, are annoyingly obvious and in your face, like the drug dealer, Tony Idaho, and Freddy Krueger. I'm not exaggerating here, you just go and kill Freddy Krueger at one point. Even the act of killing them is uninteresting, because 90% of them boil down to you going to some place, taking part in the game's awkward combat, and then returning to Randall. Repeat about 10 times. There are exceptions to this that show what the mod could have been if Someguy chopped down the amount of targets and focused on really developing just a handful of them. The Hannibal Lecter target is a highlight. He captures you and puts you in a cage, from which there are several ways to escape. It's not much, but it's something. Sadly, he's one of only about 2 targets that breaks the mold. Everyone else follows the same script to their graves, and at a certain point, the appeal of the mod is lost. You cannot carry a concept this simplistic for so long without any change, not without the player getting hopelessly bored. That is, if they aren't being annoyed, and the mod does get annoying near the end once the plot kicks in. And yes, there is actually kind of a plot to this. Kind of. Randall is killed off-screen, though this later turns out to be false, and you have to fight, no joke, a No Country for Old Man reference. Someguy doesn't even try to hide it, and nothing interesting is done with him. It's just the assassin from that movie, but in Fallout. You kill him, and then confront the big bad of the mod, Judge Richter, who is apparently the leader of some kind of wasteland Illuminati. Not a bad plot device, but probably ill-advised, considering this never really comes up again. You kill the judge in a decent encounter, and that's it. That's the end of Bounties I, which was a slog the first time and just kind of boring the second time through. In spite of the mod's problems, there's a ton of potential here. Bounties I is an underdeveloped template for a much better mod. Sadly, that potential, at least for the Bounties subseries, will ultimately go unrealized. New Vegas Killer is a pointless footnote in the Someguy series. That's not me being mean, it's a literal footnote, a non-canon alternate universe mod where instead of killing the judge, you join forces with him and become his private assassin. It's basically just Bounties I all over again, but this time you're killing quote-unquote good people. Technically, it's a better mod than Bounties. The production values are higher, the targets are more interesting, and the mod overall has more content. The actual act of playing Killer is a whole nother story. It's an utter slog to get through, a complete waste of time on almost every level. I couldn't even get through it completely the second time through for this video. The core problems of the Bounties series are still present here, but at least from a presentation point of view, there's some definite improvement. A lot of the targets in Bounties were just kind of hanging around in the game world. Most didn't even have any interiors to their name. They were no more than regular enemies with names. Killer doesn't really change that last part, but it does do a lot to try and personalize them more. They can usually be found in environments unique to them, with weapons that make sense given their occupation. Light environmental storytelling develops the targets in ways the writing refuses to do. The most impressive target in the mod is a battle against the King of the Hobos, which is basically a little co-opted mini-dungeon in the New Vegas sewers, one that weaves naturally into the existing sewer interior. One target in Killer has more effort and care put into them than all of the targets in Bounties I. And I can appreciate that, but at the end of the day, these are still just normal enemies with a name change. And the enjoyability of killing them also hasn't changed. The thing that pushes Killer from just being more of the same into a painful slog is that Killer tries to be funny. Bounties didn't take itself very seriously, but it didn't treat itself like a joke either. There was at least some lip service paid to the idea that killing people for money isn't something to be joked around about. Killer, on the other hand, is a pure comedy mod, and it moves at 100 jokes a minute, throwing joke at you left and right through its entire runtime. Normally, when this technique is used in comedy media, it's so that even if a few jokes don't land, other jokes will pick up the slack. The obvious weakness with this method is that if none of the jokes land, then the audience quickly becomes annoyed. I didn't think that was possible, though, to have every single joke fall flat, until I played this mod. New Vegas Killer will never shut up, even if you ask it to stop. Even if you start getting a headache, it will just keep going, because it thinks it's so funny, and doesn't really care to ask what you think. The biggest example of this kind of comedy is Bobby Bass, who is by far one of the worst characters in this series. His voice actor does a good job considering the material he has. It's just that the material is hot garbage. Bass is a guy who likes sex, and he will not, and I mean will not, shut up about this. He will go on long, gross-out rants about his sex life, and how sex and breasts and what have you affect your target somehow, even when they really don't. Long rants. Rants you can't interrupt in any way, other than to hit the dialogue skip button. Which I did. A lot. Randall was boring, yes, but at least he didn't talk about his erection all the time. That kind of humor carries through the entire mod. It can't seem to go a few minutes without making a joke only 12-year-olds would laugh at. Like when you go after a porn director and he goes, "Prepare for double penetration!" The references, which were already obvious and unfunny in Bounties, get even worse here. Are you tired of hearing George R.R. Martin jokes? Well, too bad, because one of the targets has you going after Jorge Martin, so that you can kill him for not finishing his last book. Gee, what a current, up-to-date reference that will in no way become unfunny in the future. Even the self-deprecating humor doesn't work. At one point, Bass goes into a large rant about how so many things happen in Goodsprings, which is meant to be a criticism of how so many mods take place in Goodsprings, even when it doesn't make sense. Despite the fact that the previous mod, this mod, and future mods have and will utilize Goodsprings in the exact same way Bass is criticizing. Just because you point out a cliché or flaw doesn't mean you can use that cliché with impunity. It just makes you a hypocrite. Of all the mods here, you do not have to play New Vegas Killer, especially since it doesn't even fit into the overarching narrative. I wish I could say that Killer was a one-off misfire, but it ends up being a sign of things to come. Before that, though, we have Russell, who, right away, is a huge jump in quality from Bounties and Killer. There are problems that keep Russell the mod from being as good as it could have been, but the end result is still something that has a lot more value and substance than either of the previous efforts. When you talk about Russell, you have to look at two things. Russell the character versus Russell the mod, and Russell the character is great. Russell was a member of the Desert Rangers, a ragtag militia that in the backstory of New Vegas eventually joined forces with the NCR Rangers, something that is immortalized at Mojave Outpost with a giant statue. Russell didn't join the NCR, though. He went independent due to his hatred of NCR's bureaucracy. He still holds a bit of resentment toward Rangers who did join the NCR, though as the mod goes on, it's clear that a small part of Russell wishes he joined up. If nothing else, then to have his family back. Russell manages to be a tough character that doesn't go overboard with how tough and manly he is. Most of the time. He even has a dark side that can be explored through a certain dialogue option, though the implications of said dark side are kind of swept under the rug. Russell opens up and develops naturally as his quest goes on, offering insight as to who he is and the history of the Desert Rangers. He also has a lot of one-off lines for locations and actions in the vanilla game, maybe even more than the game's vanilla companions. Russell feels like a vanilla companion, albeit one cut from the game because the role Russell fills was already taken. It's hard to ignore the fact that Russell is very similar in terms of role and character to Boone, and also that Boone is better written than Russell, with a more interesting backstory than Russell and more of a focus on the character's dark side. Someguy lampshades this, perhaps unintentionally, by having Russell insult Boone unless you tell him to stop. It's a nice detail, but it also draws more attention to the fact that Russell, on his own, doesn't really need to exist. He's not filling any holes left by the main game. He's still an interesting character, though, and one you're probably going to enjoy taking around the Mojave. At least, when you're not being drawn into his companion quest. The companion quest is the meat of Russell the mod, and the source of all the problems with Russell the mod. But, at the very least, it starts off on the right foot. You and Russell team up to track a bounty, a guy named Glanton. Glanton, as Russell explains, was an NCR scalp hunter who dealt with troublesome tribes for the NCR until he went overboard and started killing innocents. I don't remember the NCR ever really having aggressive relations with tribals before, but there are worse premises. This triggers your hunt for Glanton. An actual hunt, the kind that Bounties tried and failed to simulate. You go from person to person, lead to lead, and each one usually gets a response from Russell, which helps develop his character. I particularly like Vix, a drugged-up former ranger whose addiction can be handled or ignored in several ways. If you're feeling like a jerk, you could even give him more chems. This is the closest Russell the mod gets to being like something from the main game. Actual role-playing is a nice change of pace after two pure action mods. The hunt eventually culminates with you and Russell entering Cola Caverns, and yes, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, to find a weapons dealer named Hendershot. Count Chocula Caverns is a massive, albeit rather linear dungeon filled with ghouls and later tunnelers. There's a bit too much radiation in the cavern to the point where it feels unfair, but that's a minor issue. The dungeon and Hendershot are overall great. It's a good concept, executed extremely well. It's also the last part of the hunt that feels worthwhile. From here, the connective tissue between leads gets thinner and thinner. It starts to feel less like a hunt, and more like filler, which it is. You talk to a weirdly British Great Khan named Finlay, which makes Russell talk about how the Great Khans and the Rangers are the same. Somehow. You visit a random cave, then you go talk to a person who hired Glanton, and then you end up in an ant colony. An ant colony. Yes, you do have to go through here in order to find Glanton. No, it doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't come up again. And no, it's not enjoyable in the least. The ant tunnel could have been completely removed from the mod, and nothing would change. All the ant tunnel does is grind the pacing to a halt so that the player can partake in more boring combat. The actual plot is moved forward by a note that just happens to be left outside the exit, and tells you exactly where Glanton is going. What a coincidence. Following this is a short walk through a tunnel to get to Glanton. This is the threshold between the vanilla world space and the mod's new world space, Cawthor's Canyon. It's also the point where the quality of the mod goes through the floor. Cawthor's Canyon as a whole isn't very noteworthy. There's not a whole lot to do in it, because it's really just a stage for what's left of the mod story to play out on. The big population center of the canyon, and the focus for the rest of the mod, is the town of Silverwood. And Silverwood is a great idea for an RPG town. Throughout the vanilla experience, you're told that the Mojave is a frontier. That's technically true, but in practice, the Mojave Wasteland is one of the more civilized areas in the series. Silverwood is in an actual frontier, an unclaimed land where you have to build civilization from the ground up, as opposed to the Mojave, where they essentially just built up what was already there. The canyon doesn't even have any pre-war buildings. It's all wild outside of Silverwood's walls. You could make an entire quest mod on its own for Silverwood. It's that strong a premise. Russell the mod doesn't take advantage of any of this. Silverwood is just kind of dull, because so much of the town is left vague and undefined. In the vanilla game, you'd have at least one NPC who, if prompted, will give you a massive exposition dump about the community, its values, and how it thrives as a settlement. The people of Silverwood will give you broad strokes, but no one will give you concrete details. What are the working conditions in the silver mine? What exactly started the conflict with the tribes in the area? How do they get silver from here to NCR? Why does NCR need silver? What do they eat? Whether by laziness or ignorance, none of these questions are answered, and because of that, Silverwood feels lifeless. That feeling of lifelessness isn't helped by the characters who inhabit the town. They do have backstories and conflicts, but both of these are the length of a paragraph and are instantly resolved with one dialogue option. Even the general store merchant, who becomes somewhat important later on, only gives you the options of barter or repair. That's it. There's nothing specific to his character. You can tell Someguy is trying to populate the town with interesting people, but he fails in a way that makes them feel like they're just there for the sake of being there. You catch up to Glanton here, but it turns out the town has taken Glanton's side, in spite of his crimes. Glanton may be a psychopath, but to settlers like the people of Silverwood, he's a hero pushing back the tribal tide. It's an interesting idea that never really gets explored here, and is completely dropped by the time Glanton shows up again in Bounties III. Glanton himself is extremely underwhelming. He's meant to be a soft-spoken sociopath who believes so much in his mission that he can't see the fault in it. But he comes off like an edgy right-wing militia member who believes that God is guiding his actions for reasons that are never brought up at all. Then things happen. And that's the best way to describe the second half of Russell. Stuff just happens. It's not connected well, if at all, but it happens so that there can be plot. You go to find a family that by now is already dead, fight some tribals, and then go back. Glanton is gone, and uh-oh, the Legion is showing up to help the tribals. You'd think that said tribe trying to join the Legion or working with the Legion would be mentioned before, but nope, this is the first time it's brought up. Oh, and the sheriff ran away because he was a coward, which could have been foreshadowed in his dialogue, but he's just a boringly written generic sheriff, so his decision to run away just comes out of nowhere. Then you have to fight the Legion, which is the action climax of the mod. It also sucks. You can get people from around town to help out, but they're all so uninteresting you won't really care about them or what they contribute. They're just checkboxes on a list. Don't feel too bad though, because they're useless. You're going to be picking up the slack yourself. The fight itself is a slog against enemies that constantly, very obviously, respawn for far longer than they should. The entire thing is presented with no spectacle whatsoever, and the act of fighting wave after wave of faceless goons quickly becomes boring. In fairness, It is a mod, so some jank is to be expected. Although it's one thing to be janky, it's another thing to be flat out broken, and Russell the mod is broken. It's the least polished of all the mods. Glitches are everywhere, right up until the end, some of which break the quest. During the final battle, my game crashed constantly, forcing me to use console commands to actually get to the end. When I was actually able to get through the battle, the mod broke anyway, so I had to use console commands that time too. Someguy seems to be well aware of how broken the mod really is, since I learned to use console commands from him on a forum post. Apparently, these bugs almost caused the mod to be cancelled altogether, which I think might have been a better option. You can tell a lot was cut from the mod, and the lack of that content weakens the experience considerably. Something that is especially obvious when you reach the end of the mod. Earlier, if you talk to Russell, he'll reveal that before joining the Desert Rangers, he was a tribal who was enslaved and tortured by a centurion named Titus. Well, wouldn't you know it, Titus just happens to be leading this Legion assault, and Russell just happens to be here, with someone who could help him stop Titus while following a bounty that up till now had nothing to do with Titus or the Legion. Russell, for his part, happened to follow the daisy chain of clues and plot contrivances so perfectly that he ended up in Silverwood just as his former slave master was arriving to destroy the town. What a coincidence. You'd think that after jumping through so many narrative hoops, Titus would be pretty important to the mod, but he's a bit player at best. Titus accomplishes nothing for the story. Once he's dead, Russell just says, "Yay, he's dead," and then moves on with no real change. Just like the ant tunnel, Titus could have been cut out completely, and nothing would change. The mod would be way better off without him. The dramatic climax of the mod is better, but not that much better. You head to the Sandwolf encampment to find Glanton, but Glanton is gone, and his job is done. The tribals are all dead, even the women and the children. This scene would probably be more effective if you had any reason to care about the Sandwolves at all. I haven't talked about them at all until now, and that's because there isn't much of anything to say about them. As best I can tell, they're just the White Legs from Honest Hearts. They even use the same character models from that DLC. The White Legs were one-note villains, but you still got a good idea of their culture and why they were so aggressive. Here, you don't even get the slightest hint of what the tribe is like. They're attacking Silverwood because, I don't know, I guess that's just what tribals do. At least according to Someguy. And according to history, because this whole setup is an allusion to the relationship between Native Americans and the US government during the Wild West era. New Vegas is certainly a Western-inspired game, but the series has made clear that tribals are very different from traditional Native Americans. Being in a nuclear wasteland as opposed to the American frontier will do that. Trying to use tribals interchangeably with Wild West Native Americans is a very bad idea, particularly because, well, you know, it's post-apocalyptic America in the far future, and partially because treating a tribe as some nebulous, hostile entity doesn't really fly anymore, especially in 2013 when the mod was first released. Back to the mod itself, you return to see the mayor of the town, who has now become a God-fearing preacher because he heard the voice of God while hiding in a cave. If that sounds like a really random direction for a character to go in, then you're right. It is. The mayor has no remorse for the death of the Sandwolves, calling them cruel and unusual savages. And he's not wrong, because without any kind of context for the Sandwolves, they come off as cruel and evil for the sake of being cruel and evil. That's not supposed to be the case, though, because Randall loses it and wants to kill the mayor. Town be damned. It's a decent scene, but one mired by the poor writing that immediately preceded it. You can talk him down, or don't, and then it's over. Russell ends on a whimper. A louder whimper than you were probably expecting, but a whimper nonetheless. Russell has ending slides. For some reason. Yes, it added a world space, but there isn't enough here to justify having an ending slideshow, especially since the ending slides are kind of bad. A few of them are good, but most of them are derailed in order to foreshadow future events. Though in this case, it's less foreshadowing and more taking a hammer and beating future plot points into the audience. A large number of the slides end with something along the lines of, "The courier was in a duel in Utah, died, then rose again to face the man in black. Which is a good setup, admittedly, but when the majority of ending slides just say the same thing over and over again, it loses some of its effect. It's kind of odd that so much foreshadowing is put here, since it won't really become relevant for another 2 mods. And that's the biggest problem for Russell the mod. Relevance. Everything you and Russell do after meeting Hendershot is mostly irrelevant, especially when it comes to Russell the character. The ending slides claim that Russell has changed. But has he really? Nothing in this mod forces him to change or challenges his previously held beliefs. If anything, all the mod does is reaffirm that Russell was right all along, no personal reflection necessary. At almost every turn, Russell the mod takes good ideas and executes them so poorly it's hard to see the good in them. Russell is a good companion, and he deserved a better mod. Bounties II is a lot like Russell, in the worst possible way. It has a strong first half and a second half that's so below standard it hurts the quality of the mod overall. The first half of Bounties II is so strong, however, that it's able to stand on its own, independent of the late-game baggage that drags the rest of the mod down. Once again, Bounties II is built on a simple premise. There are bad guys in the wasteland, and you need to kill them. The concept is still simple, but the complexity of the mod has gone up considerably. Rather than a linear progression from one target to the next, you seek out wanted posters in the game world, and these can be done in any order, giving you a sense of agency over who you go after and when. The wanted posters start the quest immediately, but it's helpful to go back to the jail where the mod starts in order to use the terminal there to learn more about your targets. And you do learn a lot. The majority of the characterization for the targets and the mod's charm comes from the terminal. The mod even gives you the option of taking certain targets in alive, which raised my expectations considerably when I first played the mod. Sadly, it's kind of a half-baked idea. The vast majority of the targets require you to kill them anyway, and those who can be brought in alive don't take much effort to bring in. You either hurt them enough until they surrender, or you pass a single speech check that usually goes like, "Just surrender now, to save yourself trouble later." That same dialogue option gets reused 3 times. Still, the fact that the option exists shows that Someguy is willing to make Bounties II more than just another action mod. This becomes clear when looking at the targets. There are 20 targets in Bounties II, and most of them are pretty good. They usually have some kind of twist or gimmick to them that makes them more interesting than just go here, shoot guy. For example, you can catch one outlaw gang by surprise by sneaking around. You can search for some stolen Legion gold during another target, and in my personal favorite, you can confront an unrepentant slave trader in his place of business. This helps give each of the targets a sense of identity outside of being references to other media. There are still reference characters, but unlike last time, the references don't overpower the character. Red Kelly, who is rather obviously a Fallout version of the Australian outlaw Ned Kelly, is able to stand on his own as an interesting character regardless of whether you understand the reference or not. There are still junk targets though, targets that are as simple and one-note and boring as the ones in Bounties I. These targets could easily be cut out and the mod would be better for it. This would have also cut down on another issue the mod has, that being its reuse of content. You're going to see not just the same areas, but the same ideas repeated several times. I can't tell you how many of the targets went something like, "Go here, then fight an ambush." This problem wouldn't exist if Someguy just cut the number of targets down. That way, you get rid of the junk targets and the reused ideas. A good example of just how bad the junk targets are is Prometheus, a super mutant target who will likely be one of the first targets you deal with in the mod. He's located in Black Mountain, a high-level area filled with super mutants that you have to fight through. Then, after all that, you end up in a cave that somehow has huge concrete walls in the middle of it. And then you fight Prometheus, who's huge, even though West Coast super mutants don't get that big, and yes, he has the health bar to match his size. There's nothing interesting about this fight, nothing unique or satisfying about it. It's just frustrating due to the amount of enemies in the cave and how many of them are using rocket launchers. Why does this cave need 4 rocket launcher enemies? Because screw you, that's why. Prometheus isn't the worst, though. The worst target is Jacob Powers. Powers is a member of a ghoul terrorist group known as the Ghoul Liberation Army. Their whole thing is that they kidnap people and expose them to radiation in the hopes that they will turn into ghouls themselves. This is all in service to the goal of ending discrimination against ghouls. Like Silverwood, it's a fantastic concept, and Someguy put a lot of time and effort into making the GLA seem like a real, plausible group. And it's all for nothing. It's just another simplistic combat arena. All of the potential of the concept is thrown out the window for the sake of a boring dungeon. You can't talk to anyone, there aren't any quests, it's just combat. And the fact that such a great idea was wasted because Someguy refused to do anything interesting with it is frustrating to me. It's also poorly designed for combat, an issue it shares with several other targets. Someguy seems to subscribe to the game design idea that more enemies automatically means more difficult. Which isn't wrong, but it's not real difficulty, it's artificial difficulty. You're not making it any harder, you're just increasing the amount of time it takes to get through it. It's padding. Extremely obvious padding. Padding that also affects the stability of the mod negatively, since the more enemies you have on screen, the more the Gamebryo engine struggles, and the more likely it is for something to break. This approach to encounter design, thankfully, isn't the case with most targets, but this issue becomes more and more prevalent as the mod goes on. There are some major issues, don't get me wrong, but overall, Bounties II is a really good time. There's a real flow to Bounties II as you find a wanted poster, use the terminal to learn more about the target, and then execute a plan. Bounties I felt like busy work. Bounties II makes you feel like an actual wasteland bounty hunter. It's everything Bounties I should have been. At least, that's what I would say if Bounties II ended once you dealt with all 20 targets. In actuality, there's still an entire second half to get through, a second half that feels at odds with what came before it, from both a narrative and design perspective. Bounties II feels like two mods squished together, and that's a bad thing. I've said there are 20 targets, but there are actually 21, and the 21st target is Red Bear. You can tell he's special because his entry in the terminal is separate from all the others. He's the climax, the culmination of Bounties II. Every target you take down is building towards him. The big game. He also has the most effort put into him. Once again, hunting Red Bear is an actual hunt, just like the hunt for Glanton in Russell. The big difference is that the hunt for Red Bear resorts to filler a lot faster than Russell did. Here's the full series of events. Go to meet the Vipers, go to kill the Viper leader, talk to Doc Holliday, go raid a Shadow Company bunker, find some random mustache guy who wants to betray you, then kill him, talk down some raiders or kill them, go to the Sunset Sarsaparilla factory to get attacked by an overpowered sniper with a stealth boy, go meet some random kid outside of Westside, face way too many fiends, talk to a cult. Yes, a cult. Then, finally, find Red Bear. Of that entire sequence of events, only about 3 were actually relevant. The rest just waste time. The raid on the Shadow Company in particular is a very obvious time sink. There's a pointlessly huge area filled to the brim with bullet sponges. Thankfully, you can skip most of it using your lockpick skill, but even then you're in for a bad time. The Westside Kid could have been interesting, but like the people of Silverwood, his entire personality is summed up in a sentence, and one extremely obvious choice determines his destiny. Then there's some random cult in the middle of nowhere that you spend exactly a minute with. They're kind of interesting, but they're never brought up again, not even in future mods. The hunt for Red Bear would be much stronger if you met the Vipers, talked to Doc Holliday, and then went straight to Red Bear. There's no real payoff either. Red Bear shows up, and then with the same speech check you've used for 2 other bounties, you convince him to turn himself in. And that's it. That's Red Bear. It's a disappointing end to be sure, but what's even more disappointing is that this isn't even the end. Before I continue, I should talk a little bit about Doc Holliday, the companion that the mod introduces. He was first mentioned in Bounties I, and you get to recruit him here, and, well, he's no Russell. That's being generous. He's kind of awful. Most of this is down to him being very inconsistently written, to the point of making him seem bipolar. When you first meet him, he's cordial, refined, an eloquent southern gentleman. When he's your companion, he just turns into every other Someguy character, which is a tough guy who swears a lot and makes fun of vanilla game characters. Without that eloquence, he loses what makes him unique and interesting. I dumped Holiday the minute I was done with the mod, and I'm pretty sure most people did too. Once Red Bear is taken care of, You're told to deal with a guy named Johnny Rounder in a pointless, uninteresting shootout. There is some dramatic weight for Doc Holliday since Rounder killed his brother, but like with Titus, this is forced and doesn't really connect to anything. With Rounder dead, it's still not over, because you have to go into a bunker to find evidence of who killed the occupants. You'd think that the evidence would be something like, say, the holotapes and notes strewn across the bunker, but no. It's actually the harmonica stuffed down a dead guy's throat. There's no real way for you to know this. I just got lucky. Thankfully, this is actually the calling card of a man named Sergio, who takes Judge Richter's place as the mysterious puppet master mentioned in notes. You follow him to a town of raiders and slavers, which is a good idea, but, say it with me now, ends up being completely wasted. This is probably supposed to be some kind of climax, but after the waste of time that was the hunt for Red Bear, the pointless fight with Johnny Rounder, and the pixel hunt in Fisk's bunker, I just didn't care anymore. So I turned on God mode and let loose. Then I killed Sergio, and finally, the mod was over about an hour after it should have ended. If it had ended on Red Bear, it would have been disappointing. This is just disheartening. I'd have better things to say about this mod if Bounties II was split into two mods. One mod being just the freeform bounty hunting, and the other just being the linear story-based stuff found in the mod's second half. When put together, they create a mod that feels bloated, a mod that really could have used another round of cuts before being published. At the very least, the first half of the mod finally starts to act on the potential of the Bounties series. Potential that is further realized in the Inheritance. Coming from the low of Bounties II's second half, I didn't expect much of anything from the Inheritance. So imagine my surprise when it turned out that not only was the Inheritance better than Bounties II, it was the single best mod in the series on a number of points. It's certainly the best written. The Inheritance wisely distances itself from the faux complexity of the series' overarching narrative in order to tell a standalone story. I wish the series did more of these, because the Someguy mods are at their best when they're not trying to tie into one another and form an overarching narrative. It starts off on the bad foot, though. You deliver a message to a guy named Bradley, and then fiends! Just fiends. They come out of nowhere just so you can fight them, but they're quickly dispatched, and the plot gets a running start from that point on. The man who hired you, Joe Sellers, is Bradley's father, and now that Sellers is at death's door, he's giving Bradley his inheritance, a pre-war cache of Enclave gold and weapons. Didn't think the Enclave had gold, but sure. Once again, you're on the hunt. A treasure hunt this time, but a hunt nonetheless. You also have competition in the form of a crime family called the Syndicate. The Syndicate are the weakest link of the mod. They're about as deep as a drug dealer in an 80s Just Say No PSA. They dress like one too. The Inheritance overcomes the weaknesses of its villains by focusing on Bradley. Bradley becomes your companion early in the Inheritance, and he's a great companion to boot. He's light years ahead of Doc Friday, and he even manages to beat out Russell. This is mainly due to the fact that Bradley is not Someguy's default character of tough guy who swears a lot. He's still got a little bit of that in him, but he's also funny. Legitimately funny. He makes actual jokes throughout the mod. Even the sex jokes, which are still bad by the way, are more palatable than Bobby Bass's verbal diarrhea. Another thing Bradley has over Russell is that he fills a role in the party that wasn't already taken. Russell is just Someguy's version of Boone at the end of the day, but Bradley is unique. He's a self-centered merc, the kind of character you'd find a lot in Fallout 3, but not so much in New Vegas. The success of the Inheritance is its decision to focus on Bradley and his development, however limited, over the course of the mod. There's no reason whatsoever for the player to care about the treasure. There's plenty of reason to care about Bradley, though, and because Bradley cares about finding the treasure, there's a strong emotional investment into the events of the mod. The biggest mistake the Inheritance could make is getting rid of Bradley. So, guess what happens? You're trapped in a room, just one door away from the treasure, and Bradley dies. No matter what you do, he will die in this room. There are no skill checks of any kind that can stop this. No choices. There's nothing you can do. He will die. Granted, this is effective, but it only works because you have no choice in a situation that should be rife with choices. This is an issue with all of Someguy's more story-focused mods outside of the Better Angels, restricting the player for the sake of a dramatic moment. It's a mistake a lot of mod makers make due to inexperience, but you think that Someguy would have learned that by now. It's because of all this that the scene ends up being the low point of the mod. In the other mods we've covered, there would be an overlong second half that was just dedicated to the Syndicate and getting revenge. A second half that piles on plot hole after plot hole without stopping to fix the previous holes that opened up. The Inheritance, however, shows that Someguy has a better grasp on pacing now, because when Bradley leaves the picture, the mod is almost over. The Inheritance still has filler, but there's much less of it this time around, and what filler that is there is very short, to the point where you probably won't even notice how tangential it really is. The pacing of the mod is on point, and it almost makes you ignore the problems with the final act. Almost. The finale of The Inheritance is nothing special, really. Without Bradley there to ground the mod's story, the remainder of The Inheritance feels rather hollow, like you're going through the motions. You fight through some generic Syndicate goons and meet the villain, Zimmer, who for some reason wants to have a sword fight with you. This is the big decision point of the mod. See, Zimmer has an implant in his heart that will cause the Enclave gold to be destroyed if he dies. You either have to fight him on his terms, which is very difficult, pass a very difficult speech check, or otherwise let the gold go. This probably sounded like a hard decision when some guy came up with it, but it's really not. The player doesn't care about the gold. The mod never gave them a reason to care. Bradley cared, and now that he's dead, there's not much of a reason to take it. For some reason, there isn't a dialogue option saying you're here to avenge Bradley. It's all about the gold. Yes, the gold bars are valuable, but they waste so much that it's really not worth lugging them around to traders for the payout. Zimmer is also a pain to fight. He has more health than Prometheus, and deals about as much damage as a Deathclaw. He is not a climactic final boss. He's a chore. It's a good effort, but the ending of The Inheritance ultimately leaves a bit of a sour taste in your mouth. Weak third act aside, The Inheritance is great. No buts or ifs about it. The Inheritance is a really good mod. If the crudeness of the dialogue was toned down a bit, and more choices were present in regard to Bradley's fate, I could see this being actual content in vanilla New Vegas. It's that good. Finally, Someguy has produced a classic. He's learned from the mistakes of previous mods to create a leaner, stronger beast. Bounties III should have been incredible. And then Someguy took everything he learned, beat it up, threw it into a wall, blended it into a fine paste, and then threw that paste in front of a train, which then caught fire and exploded, and then got hit by a meteor. We're about to walk into the eye of the storm, but before that, let's talk about King of the Ring. It's a small mod that is dedicated to one thing, and one thing only. Boxing. It is just Bounties I, but boxing. It has all the same flaws, though it's more convenient thanks to every match taking place in one location. Besides Killer, it's the only Someguy mod I didn't complete for this video. In fact, the footage you're watching is the only footage I didn't record myself. Playing New Vegas Killer is a painful experience from start to finish, but King of the Ring just kind of exists, and I'm okay with it existing. It doesn't make compromises about what it is. Someguy wanted to make a simple boxing mod, and then he made a simple boxing mod. Would I have preferred a narrative-focused experience? Yeah, obviously, but I can appreciate King of the Ring for what it is. The other mods in the series, especially the latter two entries in the Bounties trilogy, try to have their cake and eat it too. They want to produce an action-focused experience, while at the same time drawing the player into a story that's not nearly as good as Someguy thinks it is. This paradox hurts both the gameplay and the story, and it's a paradox The Inheritance and King of the Ring don't possess. The Inheritance is almost pure story, and King of the Ring is pure gameplay. I'm happy King of the Ring exists. That's all I can really say about it. And it's better than anything I have to say about Bounties III. The entire Someguy series is built around the Bounties subseries. It's the spine that holds all of the mods besides King of the Ring together. Bounties III is the grand finale of the Bounties subseries, a culmination of everything Bounties or no that has come before. And it's the worst possible ending I could imagine for this series. Bounties III may be better than Bounties I on a technical level, but the act of playing Bounties III feels like you're playing a slightly better version of New Vegas Killer. slightly. Bounties II did a lot to expand the concept of the first Bounties, and managed to capture the feel the series was going for from the beginning. You'd expect Someguy to build on Bounties II's successes, but no. Bounties III maliciously rejects the improvements of Bounties II in order to refocus on Bounties I. The mod isn't at all subtle about its opinion regarding Bounties II. There are 2 whole dialogue options with Randall that lead to him viciously mocking the style and structure of Bounties II. Bounties III sees the first Bounties as some kind of gold standard that Bounties II failed to live up to. It's drunk on nostalgia from the first mod, whether it be the return of Randall or the fact that Randall's new shack looks exactly like the old one. There's something to be said about rewarding legacy players, but really, what was New Vegas Bounties? It was a simple, mediocre mod with good ideas that weren't fully developed. By returning to the style of the first Bounties and ignoring the improvements of Bounties II, the series regresses while still carrying the scars from later endeavors. Bounties III inherits all of the problems of Bounties II, problems that are exaggerated by the return to Bounties I's structure. Before all that, though, there's the overlong prologue with Virgil. Virgil is a subordinate of Marco, the main antagonist of the Someguy series. Marco is mentioned in almost every single mod. Sergio, the villain of Bounties III, was Marco's brother, and Marco is not happy at all that you killed him. Virgil is tasked with bringing you to Marco, but instead, he decides to take you on a guilt trip across half Mojave first. The whole point of this sequence is to make the player feel bad, to make them understand that their choices have consequences. But for that to work, you have to have a story worth caring about. And Bounties I, from which all of these visits are drawn from, deliberately eschewed storytelling. Do you remember Eileen, the fiend who castrated people for no reason? Well, killing her somehow led to some random guy, who was not mentioned until this very moment, killing a family. An action that is completely independent from anything you've done. Gee, you're such a bad person, aren't you? Or how about the Quigley family? You remember Ranger Quigley, right? Your first target? That guy who had no characterization outside of him getting syphilis and then going insane? Well, it turns out he had a never-before-mentioned family and was sending money to that family, and because you killed a man who was literally shooting at everyone because he was insane, his wife sold their daughter to the Legion. That's your fault, you monster. Questioning the player's choices is by no means a bad thing, but the only way some guy can make you feel bad is to invent stuff that was never there before, and then blame you for actions and events that you had no control over. Bounties did not give you any other choice. It wasn't about choices, and now Bounties III is punishing you for playing the first Bounties. Someguy, and through him Virgil's smugness over the validity of this argument, is a huge turnoff, and Virgil comes off as annoying as a result. Especially since, like Doc Holliday, his language and personality are very inconsistent. Once you get to Frosthill, though, you're thankfully free of him, at least for a little while. Frosthill, like Cawthor's Canyon, is mostly just a set for the mod to use as it sees fit, rather than a real place. The town of Frosthill is much more interesting. It's a town of outlaws who've come together to live on their own, outside of the reach of the law. It's still not used to its full potential, but it's clear a lot more thought went into the town of Frosthill than Silverwood. It's a real shame that you only ever visit the town twice in the mod. Instead, most of your time is spent with Randall. Remember him? That extremely bland character? Well, he's back, and I hope you liked him, because the mod assumes that you and Randall are best friends, comrades in arms, secret lovers, and that Randall wasn't just that guy who you went to in order to get more work. He's a ghoul now, which doesn't really change how he feels about ghouls. He still calls them zombies, and his mouth is fouler. Randall swears a lot more than he did in Bounties I. He's also become a bit of a macho alpha male, which I suppose you could call character development, but it's more like character derailment. At one point, he suggests that you should sleep with one target's girlfriend in earshot in order to make him mad, so that you can make it look like you killed him in self-defense. Randall has honestly become kind of a jerk. But not only is he treated uncritically, he's considered a great man, even by Marco. That's because Randall is a manly man, like most of Someguy's characters, and at least according to him, stuff like this is just what manly men do and say. If you couldn't tell before, the writing of the Someguy series has always been rather crude, with an overuse of swear words and a focus on low-effort sex jokes. Bounties III marks the point where the writing goes from being crude yet functional to downright juvenile. Most women are referred to as hussies or prostitutes, and, oh yeah, Randall's epic journey back to civilization involves a dog having sex with his ear, and an overly detailed description of said act. It's like Bobby Bass wrote this mod. Bass even has an incredibly unfunny cameo towards the end of the mod. One that doesn't have subtitles, so if you're deaf, I guess you're out of luck. Lucky. New Vegas Killer was just as disgusting and unfunny, but that was a comedy mod. None of the jokes were good, but at least they fit with the tone. Bounties III is supposed to be a serious mod, and it's hard to really get that when people are constantly making jokes about genitalia. Even the serious moments feel like they were written by a teenager because of the too edgy for you feel a lot of the lines have. Early on, while with Virgil, you can give Quigley's wife 2,000 caps to get her life back on track. This is objectively a good thing to do, but Virgil refuses to believe this, saying, "Deep down, the demon inside whispers the truth. You caused this." Oh, and here's another good line. "I like walking through a dead city. It makes me feel privileged to be alive." Most of Virgil and Marco's dialogue sounds like it came from Shadow the Hedgehog. Even when the mod isn't this bad, its desire to be deep and edgy usually robs serious moments of any impact they might otherwise have. Take, for example, your confrontation with a super mutant named Porter who's loyal to Marco. He isn't just loyal to Marco, though. He's killed children and eaten people alive, because that is just a normal thing people do. This has actually been a problem for a while, it's just most obvious here. Someguy does not write evil well. Good villains are ones whose motivations can be understood, villains who have standards. Of course, outright psychopaths are fine too. There's a reason the Joker is so popular. But the Joker is surrounded by more grounded, relatable villains. In the Bounties series, every target is the Joker. There's nothing redeemable about them. All of them are cartoonishly over-the-top monsters who eat childhood dreams for breakfast and candy stolen from babies for dessert. When every character is an unrepentant psychopath, it becomes silly. In spite of all of this, Bounties III demands that you take it seriously, because this is serious stuff, guys. The story of how Randall's ear was raped by a dog is an important part of his deep and edgy character. This dedication to taking itself seriously makes it impossible to have fun with the story, and in lieu of actual narrative value, the writing just gets in the way if it isn't actively annoying you. The story is annoying enough, but actually playing the mod is also a chore. Like Bounties II's worst targets, almost all of the targets in Bounties III have a lot of health and not much going for them. Oh, and I hope you like caves, because you're going to be going through 3 of them, and only one of them is worth your time. We're back to the structure of Bounties I, a linear series of targets that require you to come back to Randall every single time, killing any flow the mod otherwise might have. In Bounties I, the targets were boring, and the way you defeated them was even more so. But it also didn't take that much effort. You'd never be frustrated with Bounties I, just bored. But since Bounties III is the end of the story, health values are inflated to the moon, and enemy weapons are so damaging that I can only get through certain scenes by using God mode. There isn't even anything interesting about the fights themselves. It's just yet another pointless encounter in a mod full of pointless encounters. There are some decent targets, though. A few can even be spared. The super mutant I mentioned previously can be talked down after giving him a beating. One man doesn't want to fight you, and a speech check can convince him to simply leave. The best target is already dead by the time you find him, having killed himself, and his men all surrender if you give them the chance. The challenge with him is getting through his cave, which is full of traps, and I will say that Someguy is very good when it comes to placing traps. These are the kinds of targets Bounties III needed, the kind that take the lessons from Bounties II to heart. The majority of them, though, are wastes of time, and even the good ones usually have a tacked-on combat sequence that you can't avoid, just for the sake of having a combat sequence. Then there's Glanton, the second-to-last target of the mod, back again after Russell. Glanton was a very bland character in Wrestle, and what little he had there is now gone. He doesn't even have that weird chosen by God complex like he did last time. His gimmick is that you must either kill him or save a bunch of tribal kids he's got trapped in the other room. No other choices, even if you're an explosives expert. It's one or the other. It's a decent choice all in all, but it raises a lot of questions. Why does Glanton have a bunch of tribal kids? Doesn't he hate tribals? Why aren't they dead already? Where did he get the kids? Did he get them in Frosthill? If so, where's the tribe that lives in Frosthill? Why doesn't he just rig up the whole shack to explode when he leaves, instead of just the kids? What do the people in town eat? The saddest thing about Bounties III is that it didn't have to be this way. At the same camp you can find Randall, you can meet Mr. Berkshire, who is one of the few male characters in a Someguy mod that isn't a macho tough guy who swears all the time, and isn't seen as a loser for not fitting that mold. He's a shrewd politician, and he gives you his own chain of targets. Targets that aren't monsters. They've certainly committed their share of crimes. One of them is flat out the Unabomber. No joke, some guy just calls him the Unabomber. But they're actual people. They don't kill kids and kick dogs for fun. They're political enemies, and if you so choose, you can let them live. Lie to Berkshire. The morality here is a thick gray. Randall and Marco try to make your actions in regard to the main plot seem questionable, but that's all lip service. You are unquestionably the good guy in most scenarios, regardless of what they say and regardless of who your character is. The Berkshire quests are actually in a gray area. The whole Edward Snowden reference character is a bit much, but whether or not you kill him is a legit moral quandary. He did reveal the NCR's crimes, but doing so resulted in the brutal deaths of 2 NCR squads and the leaking of classified information to the Legion's Frumentari. Who is in the right? Is anyone right? Do these people actually deserve to die, despite all the people they may have killed? Berkshire, Bradley, Russell, these are good characters. Someguy is not a bad writer. He has a talent for it, but he makes the mistake of always focusing his stories on the worst possible characters. On that note, let's talk about Marco, and with him, the climax of the mod. Berkshire betrays you for relatively vague reasons, but it's still foreshadowed, at least somewhat. After that, you finally come face to face with Marco, and surprise, Virgil was Marco all along! Yay. If it's any consolation, Marco is more consistent than Virgil was, and thus less annoying. Of course, Marco is still on the courier hate train, and spends an inordinate amount of time trying and failing to intelligently destruct the courier as a character. Then, with all the bounty hunters except for Randall, he kills the mostly innocent people of Frosthill, exercising his power as an officially supported NCR warden. Oh, and Randall dies. I hope you care, because I didn't. Then he tries and fails to bury you alive in an attempt to kill your legend. Whatever that means. You're saved by Thorn, a rather minor but also well-written character. Then you take the fight to the bounty hunters, who I didn't care about, so I turned on God mode and used a grenade launcher. And then it happens. The final fight. As you can probably tell, the arena where you fight Marco looks beautiful. It's the best looking area in the series. A bit overdramatic, yes, but it's so epic in scale that you can overlook that. You can't overlook Marco's "I'm 14, this is deep" dialogue, though. He goes on a long Bobby Bass-length speech about how he broke you, that you are broken and alone and weak and blah blah blah. Marco's argument has some good points, but it relies on the idea that the courier is somehow responsible for things they never did. A position also taken by Ulysses, a character that Someguy ironically cannot stop making fun of. The difference between Ulysses and Marco, though, is that the player is given more than one chance to point out the flaws in Ulysses' argument. Marco never gives you that chance. During the massacre, you have a gag in your mouth, and thus can't say anything to stop him. But the truth is that you've always been gagged. There isn't a single dialogue option that has you disagreeing with Marco's point of view. There are some that don't explicitly agree with it, but nothing that says you disagree. Marco is right only because Someguy removes any chance of you saying that he's wrong. Marco wins because he's Someguy's Mary Sue, and Someguy wants him to win. And because of that, everyone loses. I turned on God mode and killed Marco with a grenade launcher. It was the most fun I had with the mod. I'm sure if the mod was better, this would have been a great way to cap it off. But as it stands, it's just a frustrating cherry on an annoying pie. Once again, there are ending slides, but they feel deserved this time. This is, after all, the ending of the series. There is one more mod, and that mod is the end of the series, the real end. But all of the thematic elements and overarching plot lines end here. This is the climax of the Someguy series, and what a sucky climax it is. Bounties III could have followed the inheritance to produce the perfect bounty hunter simulator that Someguy has been trying to make since Bounties I. Its obsession with recapturing the non-existent glory of Bounties I and hammering in a half-baked philosophy the player is forced to accept shackles it to mediocrity. It looks better than Bounties I, it's more ambitious than Bounties I, and in the end, it is just Bounties I, just like it wanted to be. And that just isn't good enough anymore. If the Someguy series really did end with Bounties III, then this video would end on a very bitter note. Luckily, it doesn't end here. There's one last mod, and against all odds, it's actually really good. The Better Angels is the second best mod in the series, and I'm really glad I played it. It may not exactly be a good ending to the series, but its placement here at the very end helps wash out the bad taste left by Bounties III. A lot of this comes down to the quest design of the Better Angels. Yes, the world space is smaller than even Cawthor's Canyon, and yes, there's much less to do here than in the other mods, but the quest design is really something. Everything you do in the Better Angels is building up to the defense of FOB Omega. Everything, and the choices you make all have some impact on how the defense of the camp plays out. You train troops, raise morale, negotiate to get more soldiers to help you, and more. FOB Omega feels like a side quest from New Vegas. For the first time in the entire series, Someguy remembers that New Vegas is an RPG, and has a mod that plays into the game's strengths. Combat design, sadly, has taken a bit of a dive. Even in Bounties III, there was usually some kind of flair to each fight. Besides the final battle, all of the combat encounters in the Better Angels are pointless. They're kind of just thrown together without much thought put into them. You fight some raiders in, guess what, a cave, and then immediately after, a ton of Deathclaws show up for the sake of fighting Deathclaws. The same thing happens later when you have to fight a veritable army of Cazadors out of nowhere. Luckily, each encounter lasts a few minutes at most, and you can quickly get back to the role-playing of the mod, which is its main hook. I say role-playing and not writing because the Better Angels, despite having some really well-written characters, once again makes the mistake of focusing on the wrong characters. About halfway through, the point character of the mod becomes Ranger Josie. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Josie is the worst character in the series. Worse than Bounties III Randall, worse than Marco, and yes, worse than Bobby Bass. Bobby was a loser pervert. Josie is a proud loser pervert, and that makes him such a pain to deal with. Here's one of the mod's highlights. Josie tells you the story of how he met Boone, a companion Someguy clearly doesn't like. He tells you the extremely important story of how Boone caught Josie masturbating, and then Josie finished despite Boone pointing a gun at his head, and finished all over Boone's stuff. Wasn't that just so necessary? It's not funny. It's just gross. And if Josie was a real person, most people would avoid him like the plague. The only reason I don't think someone like Josie exists is because I have faith in humanity. I should also point out that Josie gives you another story where he basically acts as a mouthpiece for Someguy to insult Ulysses. Not liking Ulysses is fine, he's not a character for everyone, but to imply he's some kind of dirty hobo in a way that just undermines another writer's work is mean-spirited, especially when Marco was really just a discount version of Ulysses. The rant comes off as arrogant and petty. The Better Angels also isn't a very good ending. Very little of it ties into any of the other mods besides a few callbacks here and there. This is a good thing, though. The worst parts of the Better Angels are the ones weighed down by the baggage of previous installments, like the super mutant ghoul duo Cocker and Cuddy. I like their voice acting, and a few of their lines are funny, but it's still Someguy humor, so most of it is sex jokes and swearing. At the very least, they don't force it in your face like Josie does. They also don't need to be here, especially since more than likely, the NCR doesn't accept super mutants into the army. They feel thrown in for the sake of having some kind of connective tissue to the previous mods, when the Better Angels really doesn't need that. Like the Inheritance, this could have easily been a standalone story, and that's a lot more fulfilling to think of it as a standalone story. The one combat encounter in the Better Angels that I would say is good is the final battle against the Legion. It's a great fight, probably the first pure combat section of a Someguy mod I enjoyed. It's very similar to the final battle in Russell, but the sense of scale and the narrative bulwark behind it make it a much more enjoyable battle. It also crashes a lot, but unlike Russell, I was willing to put up with the crashes and get to the end, because I actually enjoyed my time in the battle and wanted to see it through to the end. Although it wasn't the case narratively, gameplay-wise, it felt like a true climax, something Bounties III, for all of its effort, lacked. After that, the mod is over. That's it. It's short, yes, but better short and sweet than bloated and overlong. With Better Angels, Someguy created a mod worthy of being vanilla game content, if Josie's dialogue was toned down considerably, of course. It has perfect pacing. It has actual role-playing. It's everything I wanted from the Someguy series. And it's a gosh dang shame that it took this long to get here. The companion mod Bad Motherfucker was released well before some of the mods in this video, but I'm putting it here at the end because it's a perfect representation of everything people hate and love about the Someguy series. There's not much to say about the mod itself. It's just a super mutant who only says one thing: motherfucker. And it assumes you'll find that funny. The Someguy series makes a lot of assumptions. It assumes that you like New Vegas' combat. It assumes you're playing an NCR or otherwise anti-Legion character. It assumes that you like all of the mods. And it assumes that you like Fallout 2. Fallout 2, like the Someguy series, takes a more comedic slant on the Wasteland. Like in the Someguy series, most of the jokes in Fallout 2 are either sex jokes, overblown swearing, or references. Like in Fallout 2, the Someguy series' quests are rather linear and often funnel you into combat. Like the Someguy series, I don't like Fallout 2. I think it's the second worst main game in the series, slightly above Fallout 4. And yet a lot of people love Fallout 2. Some will say it's the best game in the series. The wackiness of Fallout 2 was refined in Fallout 3 and lost in New Vegas. And I think for some players, that loss left a hole that the Someguy series fills. For better and for worse, the Someguy series is a direct injection of Fallout 2 into Fallout New Vegas. If you like Fallout 2, then you may very well like the Someguy series, and I won't hold it against you. If you're like me, though, the kind of person who likes Fallout 1 over 2, the kind of person who prioritizes the narrative above almost everything else, then you'll probably agree with what I've said in this video. If any of these mods looked interesting to you, then go ahead and download them. Just keep in mind that they may not have been made for you. They certainly weren't made for me. And that's it. That's the Someguy series. I know I ragged on a lot of these mods, but they had a lot of effort put into them, especially since all of this was done by one guy. And that's worth respecting. Anyway, I said all I wanted to, so bye.